Hello, boys and girls. Have you ever had that film that you watched that wasn't a horror film but still had things about it that were as scary, disturbing, creepy, or weird as a horror film or something you might see in a horror film? Um, well, guess what? That's what we're talking about today. These are non horror films that are more disturbing or scary or weird or creepy than a lot of horror films. And I have these kind of separated out into kind of descending order of, or ascending or descending, however you want to think of it. From least disturbing to most disturbing or gory or weird or whatever. Um, and they kind of got a theme to them. The first section, these are kind of more honorable mentions because they're not really all that they're not that creepy or disturbing, but just they deserve a mention. Um, the first up are homages to Frankenstein. The Elephant Man and Edward Scissorhands. The Elephant Man has a lot of, I think, specific visual homages to James Whale's Frankenstein. It's not, scary or disturbing in any way, but it's about someone who was as deformed and thought of as a monster as Frankenstein's monster would have been, and this person, Joseph Merrick, really existed. And but again, it's all about his triumph and his attempt to hold on to his dignity and his humanity in spite of people's prejudices. And then, of course, Edward Scissorhands with the Deadpool slip there. But Edward Scissorhands, another retelling of the Frankenstein story. But, but given the way that he looks like he would have, been the villain in a slasher film or something. He's clearly based off of Caesar from The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And, but again, it's all about his attempts to find his place in the world and find love, despite having scissors for hands. But still, there's enough horror elements there to at least be worthy of a mention. And then we got comedies that either have disturbing elements or elements that people have perceived as disturbing. The How the Grinch Stole Christmas with Jim Carrey and Sausage Party. Now, I saw How the Grinch Stole Christmas on the big screen when it came out in 2000. I was like 9 years old, and I really dug it. I did find certain parts of it creepy and weird because like there are all these close-ups, and Jim Carrey like really. Jim Carrey as a comedian, what I love about him is that not only was he really manic and cartoony, but he had an edge to him. Unlike, say, Robin Williams, with Jim Carrey, like, you never felt safe. Robin Williams, rest in peace, he always felt like, a lovable family member, someone that you wanted to have around. Jim Carrey, he always seemed kind of dangerous, and I think that helped raise the comedic tension and helped make him a very dynamic screen presence. But yeah, he does play him as a monster, as a misanthrope, a person that likes disgusting things, and they don't really take the edge off of that quite like you would think. And I think that's what either makes or breaks this film, depending on your point of view. And then Sausage Party, I bring up mostly because besides the film itself, which I remembered finding quite funny, and I was glad that I finally saw an adult animated film in the theater. That these are astonishingly rare in America anyway. But I remembered loving it. But something that I'll never forget, like, there are some disturbing moments in this, like, for example, the food, they're sentient food items. They think that when they get bought by one of the gods, meaning, the humans, once they get bought, then they go to this heaven and everything is great, except that, of course, we know that they go to the kitchen and they get chopped up and, like, they don't spare any expense on terms of how messed up it is. So, like, the potato gets its, like, skin peeled off, and they spare no expenses with the disturbing part. And then they have like an homage to Saving Private Ryan, like that part where the guy picks up his own arm, they do something similar to that. Um, so it's like it's really, I think this is one of the most like ambitious balls to the wall comedies that I've seen. But the reason I bring it up is not just those scenes, but I just remembered. Well, and of course the ending is just, I wouldn't say disturbing, but it's insane. I love it because of how insane it is. But I remembered specifically, I saw this in the theater, and then walking out, I'll never forget, someone said, "Wow, that was so disturbing," and I was laughing at that, like, inside of my head, because I got the messed up humor, and I think that a lot of people in the audience were really freaked out because, well, most of them are probably not used to the idea of an R-rated animated film. Um, and especially the fact that the designs look somewhat like what you might see in a kids film, which again, that makes the comedy hit harder, I think. But it was just more so that I was laughing at the fact that other people were freaked out by it and they were disturbed by it. And then last of the honorable mentions, we've got survival films that have disturbing parts to them. The Revenant and Castaway here with the Deadpool slip. Castaway has probably the scariest plane crash scene I've ever seen in a movie. I really love shipwreck scenes and some plane crash scenes. It really just depends on how it's done. But like this is given the same degree of intensity as a lot of classic shipwreck scenes, and it's really intense. And again, they don't skimp on how hard it is to survive the way that he has to. And of course, the part that always got me as a kid was when he has his impacted tooth and he's gonna get an infection and die if he doesn't do something about it, and he has to use the ice skate to pop it out, and that always freaked me out. I don't know if I could do it if I were in his shoes. If I could, then it would probably take me a long time to like work up the courage for it. And then of course with the Revenant, the bear scene, of course, that's really intense. It's a miracle that, which I believe Hugh Glass, the real man, I assume that happened to him. I don't really know the full story of his life, unfortunately, but the bear scene is of course really intense. It's a miracle that he survived even that, let alone having to crawl his way through the wilderness to get revenge on the people who left him. It's just this movie spares no expense when it comes to the harshness of surviving the elements, and just how fierce nature can be, the creatures in nature. So anyway, those are some of the honorable mentions. Now on to the list. And we're starting with less disturbing things, but these films here have a surprising amount of creepy elements to them, despite how fun and happy and funny and joyous the films themselves are. What could they be? The Toy Story series. Now, why are these on here, you may ask? And these are the gorgeous, show you these one by one. These are the gorgeous Best Buy exclusive steelbooks of them. But anyway, the reason why they're on here is because I think all of the Toy Story films, if I'm not mistaken, all of them contain references to Stanley Kubrick's film adaptation of Stephen King's The Shining. For example, the carpet pattern in Sid's house is the same as that in the Overlook Hotel. And, in I can't remember exactly all the places, but just Google it and you'll see screenshots. There's references to like Room 237. I think especially in 3, there's references to that, and then probably the most blatant reference to The Shining was actually in 4, because it's when you're meeting Gabby and her henchman. You hear on the record player, you hear "Midnight 'neath the stars and you," that whole song. You hear that, and that was directly from the ballroom of the Overlook Hotel, and I was like, ah! So that was probably the most direct homage. But even if you don't pick those up, these films have creepy elements all on their own. Like Toy Story 1, it has, Sid's toys are pretty creepy. And I always loved his toys because they were so messed up. Like, my favorite was Babyface because he only had one eye. hair was cut off, and the body was with the spider legs and claws. And then, of course, like the scene at the end where Woody's head spins around in an homage to The Exorcist, and then the toys, they rise up out of the sand and the mud like a zombie film, like a Dawn of the Dead or something. Um, it's like, so they clearly loved their horror films when they were making this. Trying to think about like Toy Story 2. Oh yeah, I forgot. I was trying to think of what was the horror movie element. So there was the dream that Woody has where Andy says, "You're broken. I don't want to play with you anymore." Drops him, and he's in the trash can, and like the arms and the broken toy parts, they pull him down. Like I remember that was pretty freaky. But I think this one has some of the least. This one's probably the least creepy, and then probably the most creepy is the third one, because not only does Lotso hug and bear there, not only does he run the daycare center like a prison, but the whole climax of this, and the freaky monkey, the symbol monkey, oh, he's scary. Not only that, but the whole last part of the movie, they're descending down into that incinerator, and it's like that's basically the toy equivalent of hell. It's like you could have called this movie Andy's Toys Go to Hell, and it wouldn't have been that far off. And they treat it like that, and it's I think it has that's one of the best climaxes I've seen in a children's film for sure, if not a film in general. But it's pretty freaky, I have to say. And then, of course, already mentioned, Gabby herself is pretty creepy, and her dummies, the standard ventriloquist dummies, they're pretty creepy. And then, of course, the fantasies that these two, the Key and Peele stuffed animals, where they're the one at the end where they grow large and they're shooting stuff out of their eyes, and it's like that's kind of creepy too. But especially Gabby, I think they don't skimp on how creepy that character is. And yeah, it's just that there are more creepy elements in those films than I think a lot of people want to think about, and it's such a contrast to how happy and delightful the movies are. Now we got Batman films, and there's quite a number of these. We got Tim Burton's original Batman. This is the Zavvi exclusive steelbook. Now, with the first Batman film, obviously it was considerably darker than the Adam West show that everyone knew at the time. But, you had Batman who, in the early comics and in this film, he was as, like, scary and weird and reclusive as any creature of the night, and he kind of tries to act like that. He, is in the shadows. He doesn't want his picture taken. He doesn't really want Vicky Vale to get a good look at him, all of that stuff. And so there's definitely, well, actually the climax is lifted visually. It's very much inspired by the Hammer Dracula films. But then, of course, the part that leaps to mind is the scene with Joker having electrocuted one of the gangsters, and he turns into a charred skeleton, and he starts talking to him, and it's so morbidly funny. But it's one of those things that, even though we've got R-rated superhero movies now, I don't necessarily think you'd see something that morbid, especially not in a PG-13 film, and especially not, in a Batman film. And, that's Tim Burton for you. He can do that macabre humor like no one else can. And next up, Batman Returns. Again, Zav the exclusive steelbook there. These steelbooks, by the way, they're the same design as the Best Buy ones in the United States, except that the Zavvi ones, they come with the Blu-ray as well as the 4K disc, and the Best Buy ones only come with the 4K disc, and they come in that really cumbersome box that makes it like impossible to put on your shelf. So these are a lot easier to work with, but all the disturbing elements of the first Tim Burton movie are heightened several times over in this film. Not only because of like Batman's body count, where he torches those clowns with the exhaust of the Batmobile, but also like the clowns themselves are really creepy. Catwoman's origin's pretty creepy. The Penguin's very creepy. And obviously that portrayal of the Penguin was a considerable departure from the comics, but I think a very a very good one, and visually owes a lot to the Dr. Caligari, the titular Dr. Caligari from the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. But yeah, I mean, there's and the plot, the villain's plot is that he wants to kind of do an Exodus thing where he murders the firstborns of Gotham City, and apparently, based on the newspaper article, the Penguin was killing kids even when he was part of the Red Triangle Circus, and so it's like, infanticide and child murder. It's like those things are not overly common topics in films in general, and especially not in like mainstream superhero films with toy tie-ins for kids. And obviously that was a big contributor to the parental backlash of this film. Like, I wasn't allowed to see this for a good long time, because of how messed up it was, but that's why I like it. But yeah, I mean, definitely disturbing in a, kind of a, it's definitely like a kind of German expressionist influenced, horror movie influenced time. Both of these are, this one especially. And, they I think kind of go to the disturbing depths of Batman in a way that the other films that came later don't. But that's not to say that disturbing things are foregone as Batman movies would progress, because Batman Begins here, everybody talks about it made me want to become Batman, or I thought I could be Batman, or great origin story, or whatever. And all those things are correct, are true, but for me, what always stuck out about this film was the fact that the fear toxin creates these hallucinations that are very, I think, kind of pushing the envelope for what you can get away with in a PG-13 film. Like, he had like the scarecrow with the bat coming out of his mouth, and the fire-breathing horse, and the demonic version of Batman that Dr. Jonathan Crane sees, and the version that has like the glowing eyes and mouth. And it's like, but that's what stuck out to me, was I liked how creepy those were, and it really puts you inside the mindset of the what the fear toxin would do to you. But it does make you wonder. Christopher Nolan, he's done all these really either psychological thriller films, or he's done like these monumentally, humongously budgeted films, but he's never really done just a straightforward horror film. Wouldn't that be cool? I think so. And then almost there with the Batman films, but obviously The Dark Knight. And this one has the creepy and disturbingness, but in a different way. It's a far more down-to-earth, far more like real-life madman kind of disturbing. Because like the scene I'm thinking of is, with the Joker making that tape to send to the news, and the audio's bad. It's shaky. It's on just a standard def, consumer camera. But it's disturbing in the sense that like you see real life madmen, do that, where they make their tapes and they send them in so brazenly. And of course, the kinds of things he does are like what a terrorist would do. And it's disturbing in a different way. It's still relatively heightened, but the exaggeration level is definitely coming down relative to what we saw before. I mean, there's not a whole lot more that anyone else needs to say, because everyone's talked about this film to death. The only thing I would say is I do think this has to be one of the most violent PG-13 movies I've ever seen. They were lucky that they didn't get an R rating, but part of that is, Warner Brothers can strong-arm the MPAA, which doesn't make any sense to begin with, but they can kind of strong-arm them to get the rating that they want to get. And if the other disturbing things, so like if Two-Face with his, muscle exposing, bulging eye, the burned face there, like if that had been in an indie film, that would have been an R rating instantly. I think a lot of this stuff would have been an R rating instantly, because the MPAA is only there to help the studios. But yeah, I think this was definitely pushing the envelope for what you could get away with in a PG-13 film. And then finally for Batman, we have Joker. Now, talking about the exaggeration level, this one brings that like all the way down. Like, I don't even think you could necessarily call this exaggerated, because like this just felt true. This just felt so real to the world that we live in, as far as people with mental illnesses and people who are abandoned by society and put down, and they're those kinds of monsters are made by a very apathetic, materialistic, um, ephemeral, flippant, society that just doesn't care about people who are less fortunate. And you see people like this all the time, like James Egan Holmes and Mark David Chapman and Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. These people that they're mentally ill, or they've been put down by the society of whatever environment they're in, and they strike back and they take a lot of lives with them. Um, and so yeah, it's like it goes pretty far in depth as far as like what that kind of person looks like and how he could get that way. And this just felt so profoundly relevant to the world that we live in. And the pushback that this got by the critics, they were like, oh, it's gonna enable incels, it's gonna blah blah blah. And it's just like, you guys, have you forgotten what dangerous art is? Have you forgotten that about not only free speech, but just the power of art to affect change and to provoke thought and discussion? And it's just like, I don't know how critics got away from that mindset. That's a whole other rant. um, Now we got well, speaking of reality, we got a true crime one for you. In Cold Blood, adaptation of Truman Capote's nonfiction book about the real life killings that Perry Smith and Dick Haycock did in 1959. They murdered a family of 4 in rural Kansas because they thought that there was a good stash of money there on the farm. And it was a grisly story for its time. And this is a beautifully shot film. It was 1967. It was really pushing the envelope of what you could do at the time. Now, that was before the MPAA came into existence. And it was quite it's very well shot. It gets into the mindset of the criminals. It has just elements to it that you really didn't see in films prior to that. And that's part of what makes it disturbing. It's beautifully shot in black and white. The acting from all the main actors, but particularly Robert Blake, he absolutely knocked it out of the park in this film. And I adore this film. But yeah, it's disturbing in the sense that it did really happen, and this film doesn't sugarcoat it in the way that you might expect for a film of its era. And now this one is not a true crime one, but it's influenced by a lot of real organizations and real people. But it's Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene, and this is technically, I guess you could call it a thriller, you could call it a drama, kind of treads the line there. But why I put this on the list is because, so this whole story is about this young girl, like this early 20s girl, who I want to say she's like college age or like just fresh out of college, something like that. And she gets swept up in this cult run by this charismatic guy who lives on this farm. And they don't really go into too much depth about exactly what the cult believes. It's kind of a lot of the standard stuff as far as like purifying yourself and cleansing yourself of all the things that society taught you, and obeying the master, and don't contact your family, all the usual stuff that cults do. But then they mix in a lot of elements of the Manson family with them doing home invasions and robbing and killing people and things like that. And it's kind of about her attempt to escape the cult and try to live something of a normal life, despite the fact that she's never going to, and she does not adjust well to life outside the cult. So again, disturbing, creepy, weird in a very real way. it just goes to show how dangerous cults are and their mentality, like what they do to people, how hard it is to get out of that lifestyle, and just the fact that even when you're out mentally, you're scarred. Um, and now we get into the realm of, I don't know if you would call this next one a children's film per se, but you most certainly would say that about the next two. But I'm sure kids probably saw this at some point. I don't think it was made as particularly for them, but it was Legend here, the Ridley Scott film. This actually may be my favorite Ridley Scott film. I have not seen all of his films yet, but this one could be my favorite because I really loved what a big world he created without computers. I love the practical makeup effects and the particularly in the beginning with the forest, like you see all of the the little different layers of whatever I'm trying to say, seeds, those little fuzzy seeds and leaves, and all these different layers in the foreground, the main part of the frame, the background. That's very rich, beautifully shot, exceedingly creepy once you get to darkness in his castle. He's not explicitly the. I mean, he's a devil like the Lord of Darkness. He's basically this universe's devil and probably one of the best looking in cinematic history. And honestly, we haven't, as of this recording, we have not gotten a live action adaptation of The Legend of Zelda. But to be honest, this could have been it. Now, I think that this actually predated Zelda, if I'm not mistaken. This was 85, 86. Yeah, 85. But this actually predated Zelda, even in Japan. But Tom Cruise, which this is such an unusual role for him, you can definitely tell that this was before he became the kind of 90s action star leading man kind of guy that could do kind of whatever he wanted, more or less. He was still a young actor, still kind of trying to find his way in the industry. But I think he actually does a good job. Generally speaking, I don't really see him all that well in period films, although this is more fantasy rather than history. But it's obviously medieval in its mythology. But normally he doesn't really sink into those roles that are outside of his current century all that well, which is part of why I'm sure he doesn't get cast in a lot of period roles. But in here, I thought he really worked. And Mia Sara was one of the most beautiful women of her generation. She makes a great princess. I mean, you've got a lot of the archetypes, the Link, Zelda, Ganondorf kind of archetypes, and you've got the Mag Muck, whatever her name is, Mag Mucklebones, or the witch in the swamp. I thought that was extremely creepy. Everything when you get into Darkness's Lord Darkness's castle and his realm, all of that's really creepy. I'm sure that if a kid saw this, it probably would freak him out. Again, I hate to call it a children's film per se, because now keep in mind this was in the 80s. This was PG, and back then PG that was just on the cusp of being split off into PG-13. It just so in other words, it was an ambiguous time, so a kid probably could have seen that, but whether or not it was especially made for them, I don't think so. Now, we do have these two that are made for kids, and another one from the 80s, and it's Return to Oz. Disney's delightful, kind of sort of sequel to The Wizard of Oz, but not really, but kind of. This one's actually a Disney Movie Club exclusive. It's not easy to find. But yeah, this film, now I did not grow up with it. I saw it when was this? Yeah, it was the 80s. 80. I think this was also 85. Now that I think of it, yeah, I believe it was. But anyway, yeah, I wasn't born yet, so I didn't grow up with this. I saw it as an adult, but even then, I was yeah, I can see why if you were a kid, why this would mess you up, because the Wheelers are freaky. The Mombi with the switching of the heads is freaky. The Gnome King, he's really freaky. There's just a lot of freaky elements in this. There's electroshock therapy. There's just a lot of dark shit in this that is so. Despite it being a kids' film, it's like this cover makes it look like a happy-go-lucky time, and it is not that at all. It's quite messed up. But the people who love the movie, love it for that reason. But yeah, that is a kids' film, and it has probably scarier elements to it than a lot of kids' films. And speaking of which, another Disney film that's now this one is far more heavily marketed, especially when you're in the parks. Pinocchio. This was Disney's second animated feature film, and I remembered only seeing this. I want to say like maybe once or something like that when I was a kid, because it was pretty darn freaky. Like especially with the Monstro's pretty creepy, but especially like the whole Pleasure Isle where they are bad. The kids are bad, and then they turn into donkeys, and they don't get turned back. They just get the ones that. They get turned all the way to where they can't speak, but then the other ones they're like incomplete and they can still talk, and they're kind of sent back or whatever. But it's like those kids, they don't get turned back, and so it's pretty. I mean, the Pinocchio story in general is pretty dark, if you know the original fairy tale, but yeah, it's just like there's a lot of freaky elements in this, especially like the person who runs the who's getting the kids to turn into the donkeys, like where they never come back as boys. He has that huge creepy smile. Yeah, it's just this is a really messed up film, and again, this one's far more heavily marketed than Return to Oz is. And it's regarded as one of the best animated films ever. I have not watched it in forever. I just remembered thinking how freaky that moment was. It's like a body horror film when you get to that spot. It really feels like that. And I, side note, I love that Avengers Age of Ultron referenced this film with the, there are no strings on me. I was like, that's awesome. Now, this wasn't originally in the stack, but I just happened to have it near me, and I thought, well, while we're in the mood for some, old school Disney, might as well go for the very first, animated feature film that they did, and I believe the first. Well, I've heard disputes about whether or not it was or wasn't the first feature-length animated film. I think it was in America, but I could be wrong about that. I'm pretty sure it was, though. But anyway, yeah, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, regarded by the AFI as the best animated film ever made. It's certainly up there. The artistry is pretty unparalleled. But yeah, there's a lot of freaky elements in this too. Like I'll never forget when I was a kid, I loved the part with Snow White running through the forest and all the. See, I always wanted to believe that the forest was haunted, but I think it was just her fear was making her see things. Because once she like calms down, then all the cute animals come out. But like in my head, I was like, I wanted that to be a haunted, haunted forest. I wanted it to be really that freaky. And it is pretty scary, that whole sequence. I'm impressed. And then, of course, when the queen changes into her witch form, that whole thing is another body transformation kind of thing. Like, and they don't skimp on how freaky that is. So, yeah, old school Disney's where it's at if you want really creepy stuff. Yeah, in Disney World, I remember going on Snow White's... was it Snow White's either Creepy Woods or Scary Woods, something like that. It's a rather short ride. The ride, they built it up to be a lot creepier than it really was, but the movie itself has some surprisingly creepy moments. Getting on the home stretch here, only a few more to go. Now, this is not a horror film, but boy, does it have a lot of scary, mind-bending moments. But it is 2001: A Space Odyssey. Again, AFI considers it the best science fiction film ever made. I would be inclined to agree. But let me tell you, like, HAL is pretty creepy, HAL 9000. But for me, the thing that steals the show is every time the monolith appears and you hear the Requiem for Soprano, the Ligeti classical music piece. That piece of music is so disturbing and creepy, that every time the monolith appears, I was just like, my insides like coiled up into knots. And I saw this when I was like, or maybe around 12, 13, something like that. But like, it just, that whole thing just freaked me out. That just the music alone, like if you just set that to other music, it wouldn't have done anything. But just that Requiem for Soprano is, I think, one of the scariest pieces of music ever written, and it just tells you how powerful the human voice is for conveying emotion. Um, and the whole climax with the Stargate and all that stuff, like that's pretty freaky. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that. Um, Now this film, it's Julie Taymor's it's her Titus, and it's her adaptation of William Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, and this is the only feature film adaptation of the play. And part of that is because Titus Andronicus is considered to not be one of Shakespeare's best, but also it is an incredibly violent, incredibly gory play. And if like I saw pictures of a relatively recent Royal Shakespeare Company production of it, and like they did not skimp out on the gore at all. It was like a Grand Guignol performance. Now this film, it retains the messed up nature of the play. Like you have like the severing of limbs and the cannibalism and things like that. And for the most part, I think it does it relatively artfully. It doesn't shy away from the disturbingness of the play, but I think the part that they, they preserved the trauma of it was Lavinia. She gets her tongue cut out, she gets her hands chopped off, and she has like these twigs and stuff in the stumps there, and it's like they don't shy away. Like they do it more artfully than you would think. Like it's not, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or anything, which actually this is more gory than even that was, the original. But yeah, it's messed up. There's a lot of messed up things in the play, and they translate it well to the film. And also like when Titus Andronicus, when he sees the Queen of the Goths there, when she sees them, her and her sons, dressed up as rape and murder, and it's like, just watch it. There's a lot of really disturbing stuff in there. Thank you, Shakespeare, for making our lives just a little bit more disturbing. All right, on to the home stretch now, and these two, again, non-horror films, but they get a lot of points for their very graphic and disturbing violence. And so we got Brawl and Cell Block 99. Saw this relatively recently, and I loved it. I thought it was, the script is very well written. All of S. Craig Zahler's stuff, like Bone Tomahawk, and that's my favorite of his, and this, and Dragged Across Concrete. Those are all very well written films. I think I would put in Bone Tomahawk, then Brawl and Cell Block 99, and then Dragged Across Concrete last. But this film, it reminded me a lot of Breaking Bad in terms of like that tone and that set in that world of drug dealing and of like just, when you're dealing with the world of organized crime, like modern day organized crime, anything having to do with drugs, it's like that's a no bullshit, no niceties kind of world. It's a very bleak world, and this film definitely portrays that well, and in the same way that I think Breaking Bad did. And when Bradley, never Bradley, when he has to solve his problems, there's a lot about him. There's a lot of mystery about him that we don't know, and that's part of what makes him interesting. We can surmise a lot from what we do know, but we don't have to know everything about a character to make him interesting. But he tends to, he's clever, he's street smart. He can size people up quickly, which that's something that you learn when like a lot of serial killers are good at that. A lot of criminals are good at that. Sizing people up as quickly in situations, and he's he's not really book smart, but he's very street smart, and but he also tends to have to solve a lot of his problems through fighting and physical violence, and in order to complete his objective in the film, which is it's so it's so messed up because it's a drug deal gone wrong, goes to jail. This guy comes into his life and says, if you don't go into this particular cell block 99, by getting yourself there by being a violent prisoner, then we're going to cut off the limbs of your not yet born son, or actually I think it was a girl, your not yet born child. They're gonna sever the limbs, and it's just like, man, I've never seen a movie do that. And I mean, credit to S. Craig Zahler for not sugarcoating things and for not backing down from tough subjects. But yeah, the violence in here, there's not like a whole lot of it, but when there is, it tends to be, because of the serious tone, like this isn't campy fun at all. People have called it a grindhouse film or an art film. You could probably call it either one. I would call it, maybe more in the style of like a 70s action film, or even something contemporary like Breaking Bad, which is a crime show, but it's one of those things that like, that like this got a lot of praise, but it also got some backlash from people who thought it was too violent or too disturbing or too grindhousey or whatever. But it's like, Breaking Bad, I think it's on the same level as that stylistically, and in terms of like just it's a world that has no illusions about how cruel of a world it is. And of course the climax, like the fighting in here is great because it's like full body shots, so you can actually, and no handheld, no quick cuts, you can actually see a full fight take place, and it's well choreographed, but like to where it doesn't look like it's choreographed, and it just looks raw and violent in the best possible way. And I like that you do get to see like full body shots, and you get to actually see a proper fight take place. Like you're there and you're in the scene a lot more than you would be if it was quick cut and shaky cam and all these things that people do because they don't know how to stage a fight correctly, which even Batman Begins got criticized for that. But yeah, this is a good example of how to do hand-to-hand combat scenes in a non-martial arts film correctly. But yeah, it's the violence level is such that it can be quite sadistic, and especially towards the end when Bradley has not a whole lot left to lose. Yeah, it just, if you like violence, if you like, this is one of those movies that, it definitely feeds that primordial lust for blood that we all have inside of us. And finally, you all knew this was coming, The Passion of the Christ. Now, I did mention that in the disturbing films list, and I left it off of there because it didn't personally disturb me in the way that, it did for a lot of people. But in terms of, like, scariest, goriest, most disturbing, most, horrific non-horror films, this has got to be pretty high up there, just because this is probably the single most violent, most gory non-horror film that I can think of. And it has to be relative to what Mel Gibson was trying to achieve. But still, it's like it was this film was such a Rorschach test when it came out. It was one of those movies that you couldn't miss it. It was something that everyone was talking about because I lived through when this movie was new, and I didn't see it until years later, but boy, did I know about it. And, it was something that it just became kind of a cultural lightning rod, and everybody saw something different in it. Like, Christians by and large, thought of it as a very, spiritual film, and that it captured, Christ's suffering and, the magnitude of his sacrifice on the cross and everything like that. And then, either Jews or people that were not religious or some combination thereof. It wasn't an either or thing, but a lot of them saw it as being like really disturbing or really anti-Semitic, or that the violence obscured the message or whatever. Everyone had a different insight on it, and I tended to approach it similarly to how Roger Ebert did. I mean, generally speaking, there was a lot about his critiques that I didn't necessarily agree with, but his approach to judging this film was kind of relative to what Mel Gibson was trying to achieve with it, and I think that it definitely achieved what it wanted to achieve as far as putting you in that last 12 hours in the mindset, in the period, in the just the feeling of what it's like to see a human being go through that much torture and that much suffering, physical suffering, and to not fight back and to not, and people have kind of criticized it as being like the macho Jesus or whatever. I don't really see it that way. I see it as someone who obviously knows his purpose and why he has to do this stuff, but he's in pain the entire time, and it's like, it's no picnic, I don't think that criticism has merit, but anyway, yeah, I think most like a horror film without actually being a horror film, and certainly in the gore category, if nothing else. Well, anyway, guys, hopefully you found this video interesting. What are some non-horror films that you found particularly scary, creepy, weird, or disturbing? Let me know in the comments below. Like, share, subscribe, hit the bell icon, set phasers to stun, warp factor 5. I will see you in the next video where I'll either unbox some more Blu-rays or we'll do a wacky, weird list like this. So stay safe out there.